The Riverside Industrial District had always been overlooked. Squeezed between the newer developments to the north and the gentrified waterfront to the south, the aging manufacturing complex had become a no-man's land, where legitimate commerce and illegal enterprise operated in uneasy coexistence. On a gray November afternoon, this forgotten corner of the city became the stage for a crime that would force an uncomfortable reckoning with how a society protects, or fails to protect, its most vulnerable citizens. Officer David Chen was the first to arrive at the scene, responding to a 911 call about an altercation near the abandoned textile warehouse on Riverside Avenue. What he found would haunt his 17 years on the police force. A man lay on the concrete, bleeding from multiple stab wounds that had been inflicted with deliberate, methodical precision. The victim, later identified as 32-year-old Marcus Wellington, had been a mid-level enforcer for the Riverside Collective, a criminal organization that controlled drug distribution, protection rackets, and labor trafficking throughout the district. But Marcus Wellington's killer wasn't the career criminal everyone initially expected. Security footage from a nearby loading dock camera would reveal the shocking truth. The person who had driven a knife into Marcus Wellington's body 7 times was a 13-year-old boy named Devin Price. Devin Price stood out immediately, not because of any inherent menace, but because of how utterly unremarkable he appeared: medium height, average build, with the slight stoop of an adolescent who had learned early to make himself smaller. He had been found 2 blocks from the crime scene, walking slowly, deliberately, his clothes bearing faint bloodstains that he had made minimal effort to conceal. When officers approached him, Devin had simply stopped and waited, his hands visible, his expression distant in a way that suggested he was watching himself from far away. "I did it," he said to the officers who approached him, his voice carrying the peculiar flatness of someone reading lines he had memorized but didn't fully comprehend. "I was supposed to do it." The words would echo through 3 years of investigation, prosecution, and a trial that would expose layers of systemic failure so profound that the city would struggle to address them long after the verdict had been rendered. To understand how a 13-year-old could be positioned to commit murder, investigators had to first understand the ecosystem that had allowed him to be groomed for violence. Devin Price's childhood had not been marked by the obvious traumas that criminology typically emphasizes. He had not been abused. His home, while modest, was stable. His mother, Jennifer Price, worked as a paralegal and had maintained steady employment. His stepfather, Robert Hayes, held a job at a manufacturing facility. But Devin's home life was characterized by a particular kind of neglect. Not the dramatic abandonment or physical harm that agencies track, but a more subtle deprivation. His parents were present but preoccupied, both working extended hours to maintain their modest household in a neighborhood where costs had risen faster than wages. Devin's after-school supervision was minimal, and by age 11 he had begun spending increasing amounts of time unsupervised in the common areas of his apartment complex and the surrounding neighborhood. This was where he first encountered Terrell Jackson. Terrell Jackson, 26 years old, was a member of the Riverside Collective who had recently been tasked with a new kind of responsibility. The organization's leadership had recognized a gap in their operations. They needed younger runners and lookouts, children young enough to avoid serious police attention, but old enough to follow instructions and handle basic tasks. Terrell had been selected to begin recruiting in the apartment complexes, where the organization already had distribution networks. He approached Devin not with threats, but with gifts. First, it was video games, expensive gaming consoles and titles that a boy from Devin's economic circumstances would never have been able to afford on his own. Then it was money, discreet envelopes of $20 and $50 bills offered for minor tasks. "Just carry this package to apartment 4B. Keep watch and let me know if you see police." Tasks so mundane, so disconnected from their ultimate purpose, that the moral weight barely registered. Devin's parents noticed the material improvements. "Where is he getting money for this?" his mother asked his stepfather after discovering Devin had purchased a $300 gaming headset. But when asked directly, Devin offered vague explanations about helping neighbors and odd jobs. His parents, stretched thin and perhaps unconsciously relieved that Devin seemed to be occupying himself, didn't press harder. What Terrell Jackson and the organization understood, and what Devin's parents did not, was that they were operating according to a deliberate strategy of juvenile recruitment that had been refined over decades. The playbook was sophisticated. Identify children with minimal supervision and limited economic opportunity. Establish trust through gifts and attention. Normalize involvement through small tasks. And gradually escalate responsibilities until the point at which the child had become psychologically enmeshed in the organization and too compromised to easily exit. By age 12, Devin had graduated from simple courier work to more serious involvement. He was now regularly helping to count and package drugs, attending meetings where older members discussed strategy, and spending more time with the organization than with his family. More significantly, he had been introduced to the organization's internal ranking system, a hierarchical structure that mimicked video game progression with titles, status levels, and increasingly valuable rewards tied to escalating criminal responsibilities. "You're level 3 now," Terrell told Devin one afternoon, presenting him with a formal certificate of membership, printed on cardstock and sealed with a hologram, designed to look official and permanent. "You've proven you're reliable. You follow orders. You don't ask questions. At level 4, you get new responsibilities, but you also get more money and more respect." The psychological mechanisms at work were not accidental. They were the product of careful observation of how children think, what motivates them, and how adolescent brains process risk and authority. Every element had been engineered to exploit Devin's specific vulnerabilities: his need for acceptance, his desire for economic security, his still developing ability to envision consequences, and his neurologically ingrained tendency to obey authority figures, particularly adults who showed him attention and approval. Devin's school performance, which had been solid, began to decline. Teachers noted that he seemed increasingly distracted, arriving at school tired, sometimes with the hollow look of someone who wasn't sleeping well. His guidance counselor, Ms. Patricia Washington, noticed the changes and tried to intervene, requesting a meeting with his parents. But when Ms. Washington expressed her concerns about possible gang involvement, Devin's mother responded with defensive anger. "My son is not in a gang," she said firmly. "He's just going through a phase. He's a good boy. He gets decent grades. He's not involved in anything dangerous." The denial, while understandable, represented a critical failure point. By the time Devin was 13, the machinery of his exploitation had achieved its purpose. He was no longer simply being used by the organization. He had begun to internalize the organization's values and hierarchy as his primary source of identity and self-worth. The decision to use Devin Price as the instrument of Marcus Wellington's death came from the highest levels of the Riverside Collective's leadership. Wellington had become a problem. He was skimming from distributions, had been discussing cooperating with federal investigators, and represented a threat to the organization's operations. He needed to be eliminated. But instead of using an experienced enforcer, the leadership made a calculated decision. They would use Devin Price. The reasoning was coldly strategic. A 13-year-old committing a murder would generate maximum shock value and fear throughout the district. It would demonstrate the organization's ruthlessness and willingness to do the unthinkable. But more importantly, it would exploit the juvenile justice system's limitations, knowing that even if Devin were caught, his age would shield him from the most severe penalties while the organization itself remained insulated from serious consequences. This decision represented the evolution of the organization, from criminals operating within a system to criminals who had begun to deliberately manipulate the system itself, weaponizing its limitations to achieve their objectives. Terrell Jackson was assigned to prepare Devin for the operation. The approach was sophisticated in its exploitation of Devin's cognitive and psychological state. Instead of presenting the task as murder, it was framed using language Devin could process through the lens of the games he played and the organizational hierarchy he had internalized. "You're ready for your level 5 initiation," Terrell told Devin 3 weeks before the planned killing. "This is the mission that makes you a full member, the one that earns you the highest respect and status." When Devin asked what the mission involved, Terrell showed him a photograph of Marcus Wellington and explained, using carefully chosen language, that Wellington was an enemy player who posed a threat to the territory, and that removing him was necessary for the organization's survival and expansion. The actual mechanics of the operation were explained in language that further obscured the reality of what was being asked. Devon would be given a knife. He would approach Wellington at a specific location and time. He would eliminate the target using the weapon. Then he would leave and return to a designated location where he would be picked up and removed from the scene. What made this particularly chilling was how the language bypassed Devon's developing moral reasoning. By framing the act in video game terminology, eliminate, target, level 5 mission. The adults orchestrating the crime created psychological distance between Devon's actions and their actual meaning. In his mind, Devon wasn't being asked to murder a human being. He was being asked to complete a high-level mission in the organizational game he had come to inhabit. The night before the planned killing, Devon's behavior changed noticeably. His mother observed that he seemed preoccupied and anxious, but when she asked if something was wrong, he insisted everything was fine. His stepfather, noticing similar changes, suggested they spend time together watching the basketball game that evening. But Devon declined and went to his room, where he lay awake for most of the night, staring at the ceiling in a state of heightened anxiety. What investigators would later learn was that Devon had begun at some level to understand the discrepancy between the language he had been using and the actual reality of what he was being asked to do. In a journal later recovered from his bedroom, entries from that night showed Devon wrestling with the contradiction. Level 5 mission tomorrow, one entry read. Terrell says it's important for the organization, but I don't think I'm ready. What if something goes wrong? The entry stopped abruptly after that, suggesting Devon had made a deliberate choice to stop processing the reality of what was about to happen, a form of self-imposed dissociation designed to allow him to function. The following afternoon, Devon met Terrell in a parking garage near the textile warehouse. Terrell handed him a knife wrapped in a cloth towel and detailed the final instructions. Wellington would be arriving at the warehouse at 3:15 p.m. Devon should position himself near the entrance and approach him directly. Be fast, Terrell instructed. Don't hesitate. Once you've completed the mission, leave immediately and come back to this location. When police later obtained video surveillance from the area, they found footage that would become the centerpiece of their investigation. It showed Devon, visibly trembling, waiting by the warehouse entrance. When Wellington arrived, Devon approached him directly. There was a brief moment where the two appeared to speak, though the audio was not captured. Then Devon pulled the knife and drove it into Wellington's body repeatedly, each thrust appearing jerky and uncertain, driven by survival instinct and the weight of having crossed an irreversible threshold. After the 7th stab, Devon stepped back. Wellington collapsed. Devon stood there, frozen, the knife still in his hand, appearing to stare at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. Then, after what officers timed at 47 seconds, he dropped the knife and began walking away, moving neither quickly nor slowly, but with the deliberate pace of someone following explicit instructions. He was found 2 blocks away, walking toward the designated pickup location, where police arrested him before the organization could extract him from the scene. Detective Maria Hernandez had spent 18 years investigating organized crime in the Riverside District. But nothing had prepared her for the case of Devon Price. The physical evidence was straightforward. Video surveillance, fingerprints on the weapon, bloodstains on his clothing. The confession came quickly and without apparent resistance. But as Hernandez and her team began to explore the context surrounding the crime, they encountered an ecosystem of exploitation and systemic failure so comprehensive that it challenged their conventional understanding of criminal responsibility. The search of Terrell Jackson's residence revealed materials that made the deliberate exploitation of Devon Price undeniably clear. There was a notebook that documented not just Devon's involvement, but a systematic approach to juvenile recruitment that extended far beyond a single victim. The notebook detailed at least 8 other children across the district who had been similarly recruited, each at various stages of organizational involvement. Most damning were documents that appeared to be internal, organizational communications discussing asset development and youth pipeline strategy. One memo, dated 18 months before the Wellington murder, outlined a deliberate plan to recruit children aged 11 to 14, with specific targeting criteria: limited family supervision, economic desperation, access to school facilities for distribution networks, neurologically susceptible to authority-based decision-making. The sophistication of the exploitation strategy extended to psychological conditioning techniques that had been imported from other criminal organizations. A manual discovered during the investigation outlined methods of cognitive reframing, designed to help younger members psychologically distance themselves from the reality of their actions. The manual specifically recommended using video game terminology and point-based reward systems to normalize criminal behavior. As the investigation expanded, Detective Hernandez began interviewing the other children who had been identified in the organization's recruitment materials. The picture that emerged was one of systematic predation operating, in plain sight within a school system and neighborhood, where warning signs had gone unaddressed. 9-year-old Marcus Liu had been identified as a promising recruit. He had already begun serving as a lookout, positioned outside schools and residential areas to watch for police activity. 10-year-old Shayla Washington, niece of the guidance counselor who had tried to warn Devin's parents, had been positioned as a courier for small packages. 12-year-old Roberto Morales had begun attending meetings and learning the organizational structure. Each child had been groomed using remarkably similar tactics. Each had been identified because they had some combination of limited supervision, economic vulnerability, and family circumstances that made them available for exploitation, and each had been deliberately positioned within a system designed to normalize criminal behavior and exploit their developmental stage. The investigation revealed that Devin's school, Riverside Middle Academy, had been a primary recruitment ground. Terrell Jackson had visited the school on multiple occasions, ostensibly as a community volunteer working with the Youth Mentorship Program. During these visits, he had systematically identified vulnerable children and established relationships that would later facilitate recruitment. Principal Robert Martinez acknowledged during questioning that he had permitted Jackson to work with students but insisted there had been nothing suspicious about the arrangement. He presented himself as someone who had come out of the neighborhood and wanted to give back, Martinez explained. We were grateful for mentors willing to work with our students. This represented one of several critical institutional failures. The school had no rigorous vetting process for community mentors. Teachers had not been trained to recognize signs of recruitment or grooming. The guidance counselor's concerns about Devin had not been escalated to appropriate authorities. And there had been no coordination between the school and law enforcement regarding suspicious activities in the neighborhood. The investigation also revealed that different government agencies had possessed pieces of information that, if assembled together, would have revealed the broader recruitment operation long before Devin Price was positioned to commit murder. The Department of Child and Family Services had a file on the organization's activities from a previous case but had not shared this information with the school district. The police gang unit had identified Terrell Jackson as a recruitment officer, but had not flagged his visits to the school. Community health workers had observed unusual patterns of cash distribution to children in the neighborhood, but lacked mechanisms to report this to law enforcement without triggering privacy concerns. Each agency, operating within its own institutional constraints and protocols, had failed to contribute its information to a larger picture that would have revealed comprehensive predation. Devin Price's arrest had been processed according to juvenile justice protocols, which included several procedural protections designed specifically for young suspects. He was taken to the juvenile detention facility rather than adult custody. His mother was contacted and permitted to be present during interrogation. A court-appointed attorney was provided immediately, but the interrogation itself revealed the profound psychological changes that had been engineered into Devin over the previous 2 years. Detective Hernandez found herself questioning a 13-year-old who appeared emotionally distant from the gravity of his situation, answering questions with the careful precision of someone who had been coached on what to say, but not prepared for the complexity of genuine questioning. "Devin, can you tell me what happened this afternoon?" Hernandez began, keeping her tone conversational rather than accusatory, aware of the unique challenges of interviewing a juvenile suspect. Devin nodded and provided a recitation that sounded almost rehearsed. I met Terrell. He gave me a knife. He told me where to go. I did what I was supposed to do. When asked to elaborate, Devon provided more specific details, but each answer carried the same flattened quality, as if he was describing actions taken by someone else rather than events he had participated in. Did you understand what was going to happen when you approached Mr. Wellington? Hernandez asked. Terrell said it was a level 5 mission, Devon responded. He said I needed to complete it to become a full member. Did you know that what you were being asked to do was murder? Devon hesitated for the first time. His eyes flickered, suggesting some internal struggle. He said Wellington was a problem. He said removing him was necessary for the organization. But did you understand that it meant he would die? That you would be taking someone's life? Another pause. Devon's hands, which had been resting on the interrogation table, trembled slightly. I didn't. Terrell talked about it in a certain way, like it was an operation, like a mission in a game. This response, the admission that the reality had been obscured through careful linguistic framing, became one of the most important pieces of evidence in understanding how Devon had been manipulated. As the interrogation progressed, Devon's attorney, public defender Sarah Kim, occasionally interjected to ensure questions remained age-appropriate and to flag when Devon's answers suggested he was being led rather than freely recounting events. But Kim was also visibly troubled by what she was observing. My client is displaying signs of having been systematically conditioned, Kim stated during a break in the interrogation. This is not a child making his own decisions. This is a child who has been deliberately programmed by adults to perform specific actions. Dr. James Mitchell, a forensic psychologist brought in to evaluate Devon, provided crucial assessment of the psychological state of the adolescent. After conducting multiple clinical interviews, Mitchell concluded that Devon had been subjected to sophisticated manipulation that exploited specific vulnerabilities of his developmental stage. At 13, Devon's prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for impulse control, consequence assessment, and moral reasoning, is still undergoing significant development, Dr. Mitchell explained during a clinical interview that would later be presented as evidence. His brain is neurologically wired to obey authority figures, particularly adults who have positioned themselves as mentors or role models. Terrell Jackson appears to have deliberately exploited this neurological reality, Dr. Mitchell also noted that Devon had been systematically exposed to what psychologists call cognitive reframing, a technique where harmful actions are linguistically and conceptually redefined in ways that reduce their psychological impact. By consistently referring to the murder as a mission rather than calling it what it was, the adults who recruited Devon created psychological distance between his actions and their actual meaning. This is a deliberate manipulation of language to exploit a developing mind. The investigation into Devon's specific case expanded into a broader examination of the entire recruitment infrastructure that the Riverside Collective had constructed. Detectives identified a pattern of deliberate exploitation that had been refined through observation and experiment. The organization had discovered that children responded to reward systems that mimicked video games. They understood that linguistic framing could obscure moral reality. They recognized that children with minimal supervision and economic vulnerability were most susceptible to recruitment, and they had concluded that the juvenile justice system's limitations made using children as perpetrators strategically advantageous. This represented a qualitative shift in criminal organization strategy, AED, deliberate movement from simply committing crimes to deliberately manipulating social and legal systems to facilitate crimes while avoiding accountability. The case against Devon Price was, from a legal standpoint, straightforward. Physical evidence connected him to the crime. His confession provided detailed acknowledgement of his role. Video surveillance documented his participation. The prosecution's task was not establishing whether Devon had committed the act, but whether an adolescent could be held legally responsible for a murder that had been orchestrated by adults. Deputy District Attorney Vincent Castellano had been selected to prosecute the case based on his experience with both organized crime and juvenile defendants. From the beginning, Castellano faced profound ethical questions about the appropriate role of prosecution in a case where the defendant was a child who had been deliberately exploited by adults. In his opening statement, Castellano adopted an unusual approach that acknowledged this complexity rather than attempting to obscure it. The evidence will demonstrate that on November 14th, Devon Price played a direct role in the death of Marcus Wellington, Castellano began, addressing the jury. It will show that Devon Price held the weapon. Devon Price struck the blows. Devon Price participated in an act that ended another person's life. These facts are not in dispute. But the evidence will also demonstrate something equally important, that Devon Price was not an independent actor making autonomous decisions. He was systematically groomed, manipulated, and exploited by adults who deliberately positioned him to commit this act precisely because his age would shield them from the most serious consequences. This dual narrative, holding Devon accountable for his actions while simultaneously acknowledging the exploitation that had enabled those actions, would define the prosecution's approach. The defense, led by Sarah Kim, pursued a strategy centered on diminished capacity and coercion. Kim did not argue that Devon was innocent, but rather that his age and the systematic manipulation he had endured rendered him incapable of forming the specific mental state required for adult criminal responsibility. During the trial, the jury was presented with evidence of the organization's deliberate recruitment strategy. Former members testified about how they had been similarly groomed as teenagers, with several providing deeply personal accounts of how linguistic reframing and reward systems had normalized criminal behavior in their minds. A particularly powerful moment came when Terrell Jackson himself testified, having agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Jackson provided detailed explanations of exactly how and why Devon had been recruited, how the organization had deliberately exploited his vulnerabilities, and how the language of missions and levels had been specifically chosen to obscure the reality of what Devon was being asked to do. We understood that kids respond to systems they recognize from games, Jackson testified, his voice carrying a tone that suggested some regret for his role in the exploitation. We understood that when you frame something using that language, you create distance between the action and its meaning. Devon didn't think he was killing someone. He thought he was completing a mission. That was deliberate. The prosecution also presented expert testimony from neuroscientists, developmental psychologists, and criminologists who outlined the specific ways that adolescent brains are vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation. Dr. Patricia Wong, a developmental neuroscientist, explained the biological reality of adolescent brain development in language accessible to the jury. The areas of the brain responsible for anticipating consequences, controlling impulses, and resisting social pressure are still in the process of developing at 13. An adult predator who understands this can exploit these vulnerabilities deliberately. Dr. Wong displayed brain imaging that showed the profound differences between adult and adolescent neural development. When an adult is telling a 13-year-old to do something, particularly if that adult has positioned himself as a mentor or authority figure, the adolescent brain is neurologically predisposed to comply without the kind of critical evaluation that an adult would apply. The testimony regarding the manipulation techniques used by the organization proved particularly influential, with several jurors visibly moved as they confronted the systematic nature of the exploitation. After 7 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict that reflected the profound difficulty of their task. They found Devon Price guilty of second-degree murder, acknowledging his direct role in the death but rejecting the prosecution's request for a first-degree conviction that would have carried more severe consequences. The verdict represented a compromise between holding Devon accountable for his actions and recognizing the extraordinary circumstances of manipulation and exploitation that had enabled those actions. When the verdict was read, Devon showed minimal emotional response, though observers noted his mother gasped and reached toward him before being gently restrained by a court officer. The sentencing phase presented even more complex challenges. Devon would not face the possibility of a life sentence as an adult would, but he would face significant incarceration. The judge, Honorable Patricia Martinez, was tasked with crafting a sentence that balanced multiple objectives: accountability for the harm caused, recognition of Devon's age and the exploitation he had endured, opportunity for rehabilitation, and appropriate punishment. Judge Martinez announced her sentence with evident emotion. Devin Price, you took a human life. There is no sentence that can restore what has been lost or undo the harm you have caused to Marcus Wellington's family and to this community. But this court must also acknowledge that you were deliberately positioned to commit this act by adults who understood your vulnerabilities and deliberately exploited them. The judge sentenced Devin to 15 years in the state juvenile detention system, with eligibility for release after age 18, with a comprehensive review of his rehabilitation progress. She also mandated intensive psychological treatment, educational programming, and ongoing evaluation of his development. The sentence reflected a judicial recognition that traditional adult criminal responsibility could not be appropriately applied to a case involving a 13-year-old who had been systematically manipulated into committing murder. The prosecution of Terrell, Jackson, and the organization's leadership proceeded with far greater severity. Jackson received a 28-year sentence for conspiracy to commit murder, child endangerment, and racketeering. 3 other senior members of the organization received similar sentences, with a federal RICO case adding additional decades of potential incarceration. But the charges against the adults revealed the limited nature of legal accountability. While the adults who had orchestrated the recruitment and exploitation of Devin could be punished, the legal system lacked adequate mechanisms to address the systemic nature of how the organization had operated, or the systemic failures that had enabled the exploitation. This recognition prompted a broader examination of how institutions, schools, law enforcement, child welfare agencies, community health organizations had each failed to recognize or respond to the predation operating in their community. Riverside Middle Academy underwent a comprehensive audit that revealed multiple failures: inadequate vetting of community mentors, failure to train teachers to recognize recruitment and grooming, lack of coordination with law enforcement, and absence of protocols for escalating guidance counselor concerns. Principal Robert Martinez was dismissed, and the school district implemented sweeping changes to its mentorship and community engagement policies. The police department acknowledged that gang unit information about Terrell Jackson's activities had not been shared with school officials or coordinated with community health agencies. A new protocol was implemented requiring law enforcement to share intelligence about suspected recruitment activities with the school district and other relevant agencies. The Department of Child and Family Services acknowledged that it had information about the organization's activities but lacked adequate legal authority to share this information with schools without triggering privacy concerns. New memoranda of understanding were established between the department and school systems to allow sharing of relevant threat information while maintaining appropriate confidentiality. These institutional changes, while important, represented only a partial response to the systemic failures that had enabled Devin Price's exploitation. The broader reality remained that poverty, inadequate after-school programming, limited economic opportunity, and the deliberate predatory targeting of vulnerable children continued to create the conditions that enabled exploitation. 5 years after the murder of Marcus Wellington, Devin Price, now 18 years old, was eligible for supervised release from the juvenile detention facility. His case had attracted attention from juvenile justice reform advocates and criminologists interested in how young people who had committed serious crimes could be rehabilitated and reintegrated into society. Devin's time in detention had been marked by intensive therapeutic intervention, educational achievement, and what his treatment providers described as painful but necessary psychological growth. Housed in the Riverside Youth Rehabilitation Center, Devin had progressed through treatment focused on helping him understand the reality of his actions, develop genuine remorse, and construct an identity separate from the organization that had exploited him. Dr. James Mitchell, the forensic psychologist who had initially evaluated Devin, continued to oversee his treatment during his incarceration. In his most recent assessment, Mitchell noted significant developmental progress. Devin has moved from the dissociated state in which he initially viewed his actions as a video game mission to a developmentally appropriate understanding of the permanence of death and the profound harm his actions caused. This progression has been accompanied by appropriate grief and a commitment to understanding how he was manipulated and exploited. Education had become Devin's primary focus. He had completed his high school education while incarcerated and had begun college-level coursework through a program that allowed young offenders to earn degrees while serving their sentences. Teachers and academic advisors noted his exceptional abilities and his apparent commitment to intellectual development. Perhaps most remarkably, Devin had participated in a restorative justice program designed to bring victims and offenders together in structured therapeutic settings. Marcus Wellington's family, while devastated by his death, had agreed to meet with Devin as part of their own healing process. The meeting, which occurred when Devin was 16, had been carefully facilitated by trained mediators. Wellington's mother, Catherine, had come to the session with profound ambivalence, grief for the son she had lost, but also recognition that Devin was himself a victim of systematic exploitation. "I want to understand why," she told Devin during that initial meeting. "I want to understand how a child could be used this way." Devin's response came after a long silence. "They made it not real," he said, his voice barely audible. "They used words that made it sound like a game. They made me feel like it didn't matter. But I know now that it did. I know that what I did was real and that I hurt people, and that nothing I do will fix that." That conversation became the beginning of an unusual partnership. Catherine Wellington began visiting Devin regularly, bringing photographs and stories about Marcus, not to punish Devin with the weight of what had been lost, but to help him understand the full humanity of the person he had killed. Over time, this relationship evolved into a collaborative effort to develop prevention materials that could help other vulnerable children resist similar exploitation. Catherine would describe her son's life, his dreams, the person he had been. Devin would explain, from the perspective of someone who had been manipulated, exactly how predators identified vulnerable children and the techniques they used to normalize criminal behavior. This collaboration resulted in the Wellington Protocol, a curriculum designed to be taught in schools serving communities at risk for criminal recruitment. The program taught children to recognize grooming tactics, understand how language could be manipulated to obscure harmful actions, and develop critical thinking about adult authority, figures who offered rewards or status. The program had been piloted in 12 schools across the district and was being considered for broader implementation across the state. The institutional changes that followed Devin Price's case extended beyond individual organizations to broader policy and legal frameworks. State legislators, motivated by public outcry over how thoroughly the criminal organization had exploited a child while operating in plain sight, passed the Price-Wellington Child Protection Act. The legislation mandated several significant changes. First, it required enhanced screening and vetting processes for anyone working with children in school or community settings. Background checks now specifically inquired about previous gang affiliation or criminal recruitment activities. Second, it created new criminal penalties specifically targeting adults who recruited children under 15 for criminal activities, establishing a distinct crime category called predatory recruitment of minors that carried mandatory minimum sentences. Third, it funded the creation of specialized law enforcement units focused on identifying and disrupting juvenile recruitment operations before they culminated in serious crimes. These units were trained specifically in adolescent development, grooming tactics, and the psychological manipulation techniques used to exploit young people. Fourth, it established mandatory information sharing protocols between law enforcement, schools, child welfare agencies, and community health organizations regarding suspected recruitment or grooming activities. While maintaining appropriate confidentiality protections, these agencies were now required to share relevant threat information. Fifth, it mandated training for teachers and school administrators focused on recognizing signs of juvenile recruitment and grooming, with protocols for escalating concerns to appropriate authorities. The legislation also included funding for expanded after-school and summer programming in neighborhoods identified as high risk for recruitment, recognizing that unsupervised time was a critical vulnerability that predators specifically targeted. Federal funding was allocated to support research into intervention programs for children who had been recruited into criminal organizations but had not yet committed serious crimes. The research focused on whether early identification and intervention could prevent the trajectory from recruitment to violence that had characterized Devin's experience. The criminal prosecution of Terrell Jackson and other members of the Riverside Collective proceeded in parallel with these institutional reforms. Jackson ultimately received a sentence of 28 years, with the prosecution emphasizing the deliberate nature of his exploitation of a child. The sentencing statement from the judge specifically noted that Jackson had weaponized a child's developmental vulnerabilities for criminal purposes, and that the sentence reflected society's commitment to protecting children from such predation. When Devin Price was released from juvenile detention at age 18, with the possibility of supervised release, he faced the profound challenge of reintegrating into a community that now knew him as the kid who killed for a gang. The stigma was immediate and pervasive. Employers were reluctant to hire him. Landlords refused to rent to him. Social relationships remained complicated by the knowledge of his crime. But Devin also had resources and support that many young people transitioning from the juvenile justice system did not possess. Catherine Wellington's advocacy had helped create opportunities for Devin to speak publicly about his experience, warning other young people about recruitment tactics and explaining how psychological manipulation had facilitated his crime. Through the Wellington Protocol collaboration, Devin had discovered a purpose that extended beyond his own rehabilitation. Speaking to school groups about his experience became not just therapeutic for Devin, but genuinely helpful to the young people he addressed. Children recognized him as someone who had been where they were, vulnerable, seeking belonging, targeted by predators, and his credibility was powerful. "I'm not here to tell you I made a mistake," Devin told a group of 8th graders at Riverside Middle Academy 5 years after his release from detention. "I'm here to tell you that I didn't understand what was being done to me. I didn't recognize that adults were manipulating me until it was too late. I want you to be smarter than I was. I want you to recognize those manipulations before you've done something you can never take back." By his mid-20s, Devin had earned a bachelor's degree and was working toward a master's degree in social work, with a focus on juvenile rehabilitation and prevention of recruitment. He had become a consultant to the police department's newly created Youth Recruitment Prevention Unit, helping officers understand the perspective of vulnerable young people and how to identify children in the early stages of recruitment. His relationship with Catherine Wellington remained central to his life. She had become, in many ways, his mentor and closest confidant, a relationship that had been forged in the crucible of shared trauma and had evolved into genuine care and mutual commitment to preventing similar tragedies. 10 years after Marcus Wellington's death, the Riverside District had undergone a transformation that reflected both progress and ongoing challenges in addressing how vulnerable children become targets for criminal exploitation. The Riverside Youth Exploitation Prevention Unit, established in the wake of the case, had become a model for law enforcement agencies across the state. The unit's primary focus was not prosecution of young people already involved in criminal organizations, but early identification and intervention before recruitment escalated to serious crimes. Working in collaboration with schools, the unit had developed an early warning system that flagged children displaying patterns consistent with recruitment: unexplained cash, sudden access to expensive goods, increasing absences from school, behavioral changes suggesting anxiety or divided attention, and developing relationships with significantly older teenagers. When a child met several of these criteria, the unit initiated a protocol that began not with investigation, but with connection. A trained community liaison, often someone with personal experience in gangs or the juvenile justice system, would establish a relationship with the child, offering legitimate opportunities for mentorship, education, and economic opportunity that addressed the vulnerabilities that predators exploited. The results had been measurable. In the first 5 years of the program's operation, juvenile recruitment rates in the Riverside District decreased by 43%. More importantly, serious crimes by juveniles in the district dropped by 56%. Police officials credited the prevention focus with interrupting the pipeline that had allowed predators to systematically exploit vulnerable children, but the program also revealed the limitations of law enforcement intervention alone. While the unit could identify at-risk children and offer alternative opportunities, the fundamental economic and social conditions that made children vulnerable to exploitation remained largely unchanged. Poverty persisted. Schools continued to operate with limited resources. After-school programming remained inadequate, This reality became increasingly apparent to Devon as he worked with the prevention unit. He observed that while intervention could redirect individual children away from recruitment, the systemic conditions that created vulnerability remained intact. "We keep talking about protecting children from predators," Devon told Detective Maria Hernandez during a training session, "but we're not addressing why children are vulnerable to begin with. These kids aren't being recruited because they're inherently prone to crime. They're being recruited because they're poor, unsupervised, and seeking belonging and economic security. Until we address those conditions, we're just treating the symptom." Hernandez acknowledged the truth of this observation. "You're right," she said, "but that's a bigger problem than law enforcement can solve alone. That requires political will, funding, and changes to how society prioritizes investment in low-income communities." The observation reflected a broader realization that had emerged from the case, that the exploitation of juvenile offenders by criminal organizations was not primarily a criminal justice problem but a failure of society to adequately protect and invest in vulnerable children. Catherine Wellington had become, in her own right, an advocate for systemic change and prevention. The Wellington Protocol curriculum that she and Devon had developed together had expanded from 12 pilot schools to a comprehensive program implemented across 47 schools in urban districts across 3 states. The curriculum addressed not just the identification of recruitment tactics but the psychological vulnerabilities that made children susceptible to manipulation. It taught children about cognitive reframing, helping them understand how language could be manipulated to obscure harmful reality. It provided information about adolescent brain development, explaining why young people were neurologically predisposed to obey authority figures and struggle with consequence assessment. Importantly, it also addressed the economic vulnerabilities that made children targets. The curriculum included financial literacy education, information about legitimate job opportunities, and resources for connecting students to mentorship and educational advancement. Teacher feedback consistently indicated that the most powerful component of the curriculum was Devon's direct testimony to students about his own experience. Seeing someone who had been exploited in the way they were now being warned about someone who bore the obvious weight of his experience created an immediacy and credibility that abstract educational content could not achieve. When Devon talks about how he didn't realize he was being manipulated until it was too late, you can see it click for kids, one educator noted. They recognize that if it could happen to him, it could happen to them. That recognition seems to create the psychological space for them to make different choices. The expansion of the Wellington Protocol reflected broader recognition of what had emerged from Devon's case, that prevention was not only more effective than punishment but also more humane. It cost far less to intervene with a vulnerable child before recruitment occurred than to prosecute, incarcerate, and rehabilitate a young person after they had been manipulated into committing serious crimes. The case of Devon Price also prompted evolution in how prosecutors approached cases involving young offenders who had been systematically exploited by adults. Deputy District Attorney Vincent Castellano, who had prosecuted Devon's case, became a vocal advocate for prosecutorial approaches that acknowledge the complexity of juvenile exploitation cases. Traditional prosecution treats a young offender as a fully autonomous agent making independent criminal decisions. Castellano explained in a presentation to the American Prosecutors Association. But in cases involving systematic recruitment and exploitation, that model is inadequate. We need prosecution approaches that simultaneously hold young offenders accountable for their actions while pursuing far more serious consequences for the adults who orchestrated and facilitated those actions. This perspective led to changes in prosecutorial strategy across multiple jurisdictions. Prosecutors began training to recognize signs of exploitation in cases involving young offenders. Sentencing recommendations increasingly reflected this recognition, with prosecutors arguing for more intensive consequences for adult manipulators, while seeking rehabilitation-focused sentences for exploited juveniles. More significantly, prosecutors began working more collaboratively with social service agencies to connect young offenders with rehabilitation opportunities rather than pursuing maximum sentences that would result in long-term incarceration, with limited possibility for change. The federal government, responding to concerns about organized crime's targeting of juveniles, created a new task force specifically focused on prosecuting adults who recruited children for criminal purposes. The task force worked across federal, state, and local jurisdictions to identify recruitment operations and pursue RICO charges against organizations that had systematized the exploitation of minors. The Riverside Collective, which had been partially disrupted following the murder investigation, remained a target of ongoing federal investigation. Additional members were prosecuted over the succeeding years as the investigation identified the extent of the organization's recruitment infrastructure. But the transformation in Riverside and the national attention to juvenile exploitation could not reverse the fundamental harm that had been caused. Marcus Wellington remained dead. His family had been devastated by the loss of a person they loved. The emotional and psychological impact of his murder rippled through his family for the rest of their lives. Catherine Wellington had found meaning through her advocacy work, but that meaning existed alongside persistent grief. She attended the annual memorial service for Marcus, where family, friends, and community members gathered to remember him. Each year the gathering was smaller, friends moved away. The immediate circle of those who had known Marcus personally diminished, but Catherine maintained the tradition. Devon's attendance at these services, which had begun tentatively and with significant emotional difficulty, had become a consistent part of the ritual. He stood separately from Catherine's immediate family, but his presence was acknowledged. Over time, as years passed and the acute anger of early grief evolved into the more complex sadness that characterizes loss over extended time, family members approached Devon with recognition that he, too, bore the weight of what had happened. "You weren't the real killer," Catherine's sister Maria told Devon during one memorial service, speaking words that emerged from the difficult emotional work of understanding how a child could be weaponized to commit violence. "You were a weapon. But that doesn't mean you have no responsibility. It means your responsibility is different from what it would have been if you had made a free choice." This distinction between responsibility and culpability, between accountability and punishment, had become the fundamental challenge that legal systems and communities grappled with in cases involving juvenile exploitation. 15 years after the murder of Marcus Wellington, as Devon Price approached his 30th birthday, he sat for a comprehensive interview about his experience. He was now working as the director of the Riverside Youth Prevention and Rehabilitation Initiative, overseeing a comprehensive program that combined law enforcement intervention, community-based mentorship, educational support, and rehabilitative opportunities for young people at risk of recruitment or already involved in criminal organizations. When asked what he had learned from his experience, Devon's response was measured and thoughtful, reflecting the psychological growth and maturation that had characterized his journey through rehabilitation. "I think I've learned that there aren't simple categories in this kind of situation," he explained. "I committed a murder. That's not a category error or something that can be minimized. I took a human life, but I also didn't choose to put myself in the position to commit that murder. Adults who understood child psychology deliberately exploited my vulnerabilities to position me to commit that act. Both things are true at the same time," he continued. "I bear responsibility for my actions, but I was also victimized through systematic exploitation. Michael Wellington, the man I killed, he was victimized through murder. Catherine Wellington was victimized through the loss of her son. But I was also victimized through being weaponized by adults who should have protected me. The challenge is creating justice systems and societal responses that acknowledge all of these truths simultaneously, that hold perpetrators accountable, that grieve what was lost, but that also recognize and interrupt the conditions that enable such harm in the first place." When asked what he would say to children who were being recruited into criminal organizations, Devon spoke with the particular authority of someone who had lived that experience and emerged from it. "I would tell them that what feels like opportunity and belonging is actually predation. That the people offering you money and status are deliberately exploiting your desire for those things. That the language they use to describe what they want you to do, calling it missions, calling it business, is designed to obscure what's actually happening. And I would tell them that if they resist, if they walk away, there are people who will help them. There are opportunities for legitimate education, legitimate jobs, legitimate belonging. It requires more patience and it's less immediately exciting, but it doesn't require you to betray your own humanity or commit acts that will haunt you for the rest of your life. 20 years after the murder of Marcus Wellington, on an autumn afternoon much like the one when the crime had occurred, a new memorial was unveiled in the Riverside District. The memorial was not dedicated solely to Marcus Wellington, though his name was prominently inscribed. Instead, it was dedicated more broadly to the recognition of how systems fail children and how societal failures could be interrupted through sustained commitment to prevention, rehabilitation, and justice that acknowledged complexity. The inscription read, "In memory of Marcus Wellington, whose life was taken, in recognition of Devon Price, whose childhood was weaponized, and in commitment to all vulnerable children, that we will build systems that protect rather than exploit their vulnerability." The dedication ceremony brought together the key figures in the case. Catherine Wellington, now in her 70s and having devoted the latter part of her life to preventing juvenile recruitment. Devon Price, now leading prevention work in multiple districts. Detective Maria Hernandez, who had retired from law enforcement and was consulting with jurisdictions implementing prevention protocols. Judge Patricia Martinez, who had presided over Devon's trial and subsequent hearings. And numerous community members, educators, and law enforcement officials whose work had been shaped by the case. Catherine spoke first, addressing the assembled crowd. "This case taught me something I did not expect to learn," she said, her voice still carrying the particular clarity that comes from years of processing grief. "It taught me that justice is not something that exists on a spectrum from punishment to forgiveness. Justice is something that must simultaneously hold multiple truths. That harm was caused and must be acknowledged. That people are responsible for their actions and must face consequences. But that people are also shaped by the systems around them, and that those systems can be changed to prevent similar harm. My son is still gone," she continued, pausing as emotion briefly overcame her composure. "But I believe that the work we've done to prevent children from being exploited and weaponized as Devon was exploited honors his memory in a way that pure punishment never could." Devon spoke briefly, his remarks focusing on the children still in the district and across the country who were currently being targeted by predators. "The work isn't finished," he said simply. "Every day there are children being identified by adults who understand how to manipulate them. Every day there are vulnerable young people being positioned to commit acts that will define their lives. What we've learned from this case, what we've built in response to this case, has to keep evolving. We have to stay vigilant. We have to stay committed to interrupting this exploitation before it creates another tragedy like the one that brought us all together." As the sun set on the memorial dedication, people lingered in small groups, speaking about the case that had transformed their understanding of justice, childhood exploitation, and the possibility of redemption even after terrible violence. The memorial stood as physical testament to the recognition that systemic failures could be addressed, that young people could be protected, and that even after profound tragedy, there was possibility for something meaningful to emerge from the ashes. The case of Devon Price and Marcus Wellington had not solved the problem of juvenile recruitment by criminal organizations or eliminated the vulnerabilities that predators exploited. It had not restored the life that was lost or erased the trauma that had been inflicted, but it had created institutional change, policy evolution, and increased public understanding of how vulnerable children could be systematically exploited. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that recognition of exploitation need not preclude accountability, that rehabilitation was possible even after serious crime, and that communities could choose to respond to such cases by transforming systems rather than simply punishing individuals. In the years that would follow, the lessons from this case would continue to evolve and influence how systems approach the protection of vulnerable children, the prosecution of those who exploited them, and the rehabilitation of young people who had been weaponized by adults. The memorial in Riverside stood as testament to that ongoing commitment, not to perfection, but to the persistent effort to build systems that protected children rather than failing them.